What would you do if you saw your own dog standing in your yard while your actual dog was sitting right next to you? Tonight, we're covering two real Skinwalker encounters where people came face to face with something that can perfectly mimic anything it wants. These aren't internet stories. These are first-hand accounts that will absolutely mess with your head. You are watching Grimtrue, and let's dive in. What if I told you there's a place in Utah where bullets bounce off wolves, cattle disappear without a trace, and the government has spent millions trying to figure out what the hell is going on? Welcome to Skinwalker Ranch, a 512-acre property that's been called the most scientifically studied paranormal hotspot in the world. And honestly, after diving into this rabbit hole, I'm not sure if that makes it more credible or more terrifying. The ranch sits in Utah's Uinta Basin, about 150 miles east of Salt Lake City. It's high desert country, the kind of place where you can see for miles in every direction and feel completely alone. The landscape is rugged, dotted with juniper trees and sagebrush, surrounded by mesas and canyons that have been carved out over millions of years. It's beautiful in that stark western way, but there's something about the isolation that makes your skin crawl when you start hearing the stories that come out of this place. For the Ute tribe, this area has always been off-limits. They call it the Path of the Skinwalker, and traditional Ute people won't even talk about it openly. In their culture, skinwalkers are essentially witches or sorcerers who have gained the supernatural ability to turn into animals. But these aren't your typical werewolf stories. We're talking about something much darker, something that violates the natural order so fundamentally that even mentioning it is considered dangerous. The Utes have avoided this particular stretch of land for generations, treating it as cursed ground where bad things happen to anyone foolish enough to stick around. Now, you might be thinking this is just old folklore, the kind of stories that get passed down to keep kids from wandering too far from home. But then the Sherman family bought the place in 1994, and everything changed. Terry and Gwen Sherman were ranchers from New Mexico looking for a fresh start. They saw 512 acres of prime grazing land at what seemed like a bargain price, and they jumped on it. What they didn't know was that they were about to become the main characters in one of the strangest stories in American paranormal history. The weirdness started almost immediately. Terry Sherman was a practical guy, the kind of rancher who'd spent his whole life dealing with predators, weather, and the everyday challenges of raising cattle. He wasn't the type to jump at shadows or make up stories. But within weeks of moving to the ranch, he was dealing with things that didn't make sense according to everything he knew about the natural world. The first major incident happened on a winter evening in 1995. Terry heard his cattle getting agitated outside, which wasn't unusual. Coyotes and wolves were common in the area, and any rancher worth his salt knows you don't ignore the sound of spooked livestock. He grabbed his rifle and headed out to investigate, expecting to find a pack of coyotes or maybe a mountain lion prowling around his herd. What he found instead was a wolf, but not like any wolf he'd ever seen. This thing was massive, easily twice the size of any wolf that should exist in Utah. It was standing at the edge of his property, just watching the cattle with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Terry had dealt with wolves before, and they typically ran when they saw humans. This one just stood there, staring at him like it was sizing him up. Terry raised his rifle and fired. He was a good shot, had been hunting his whole life, and he knew he hit the animal's center mass. The wolf didn't even flinch. It just kept staring at him with those yellow eyes. So Terry fired again and again. He put at least 4 rounds into this thing at close range, shots that should have dropped any animal instantly. The wolf acted like he was shooting blanks. After the 4th shot, the wolf finally turned and started walking away, not running, just casually strolling off like nothing had happened. Terry followed, trying to understand what he'd just witnessed. The tracks were clear in the snow at first, massive paw prints that were definitely from the wolf he'd just shot. But as he followed them, something impossible happened. The tracks just stopped. Not like the animal had jumped or changed direction, they literally ended in the middle of an open field with no cover anywhere around. Terry searched the area for hours, looking for blood, hair, anything that would prove he'd actually hit the animal. He found nothing. No evidence that he'd wounded it. No sign of where it had gone. It was like the wolf had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the memory of those intelligent yellow eyes and the growing realization that something was very wrong with his new property. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next 2 years, the Sherman family documented dozens of similar encounters. Cattle would disappear overnight from locked pastures, leaving behind no tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. Sometimes they'd find the animals days later, mutilated in ways that defied explanation. Perfectly circular holes cut into the flesh with surgical precision, organs removed without any blood on the ground, cuts that looked like they'd been made with advanced medical equipment rather than the teeth and claws of predators. The family also reported regular UFO sightings. Not just lights in the sky, but structured craft that would hover silently over their property, sometimes for hours at a time. Terry described seeing objects the size of football fields moving without making any sound, equipped with lights that seemed to respond to their presence. When they'd try to approach these craft, they would simply disappear, often reappearing minutes later in a completely different location. Inside the ranch house, the family dealt with what can only be described as poltergeist activity. Doors would slam shut on their own, objects would move across rooms, and they'd hear voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize. Their dogs, tough ranch animals that had never shown fear of anything, would refuse to enter certain areas of the property. The family's children reported seeing figures moving around outside their windows at night, humanoid shapes that didn't quite look right. But it was the wolf encounter that really stuck with Terry Sherman. He'd replayed that night in his head thousands of times, trying to find a rational explanation for what he'd experienced. He was certain he'd hit the animal, certain the shots were on target. He'd examined his rifle afterward, tested it on other targets, and it worked perfectly. The ammunition was standard hunting rounds, the kind he'd used successfully for years. There was no logical reason why those bullets shouldn't have affected the wolf. The Sherman family tried to document everything they experienced, keeping detailed logs of incidents, taking photographs when possible, and even installing security cameras around the property. But the phenomena seemed to respond to their efforts to record it. Cameras would malfunction at crucial moments, batteries would drain instantly, and electronic equipment would fail without explanation. It was as if whatever was happening on the ranch didn't want to be documented. By 1996, the stress of living on the property had become unbearable. The family was dealing with constant sleep deprivation, financial losses from missing cattle, and the psychological toll of never knowing what they might encounter next. Terry Sherman made the difficult decision to sell the ranch, even though it meant taking a significant financial loss. He'd invested everything in the property, but no amount of money was worth what his family was going through. The story might have ended there, just another family driven away by unexplained phenomena, if not for the fact that their buyer was Robert Bigelow, a Las Vegas real estate mogul with a serious interest in UFO research. Bigelow had founded the National Institute for Discovery Science, a privately funded organization dedicated to studying anomalous phenomena using rigorous scientific methods. When he heard about the Sherman family's experiences, he saw an opportunity to conduct the kind of long-term systematic investigation that had never been attempted at a location with such consistent paranormal activity. NADS moved quickly to establish a permanent research presence on the ranch. They installed sophisticated monitoring equipment throughout the property, including electromagnetic sensors, radiation detectors, infrared cameras, and seismic monitors. They brought in a team of scientists with backgrounds in physics, biology, psychology, and other relevant fields. The goal was to approach the phenomena with the same methodical rigor that would be applied to any other scientific investigation. What they found over the next several years was both fascinating and frustrating. The monitoring equipment did detect anomalies, electromagnetic fluctuations that couldn't be explained by known natural phenomena, radiation spikes that appeared and disappeared without apparent cause, and infrared signatures that suggested the presence of large, warm-blooded creatures that couldn't be visually confirmed. But the phenomena seemed to be aware of the scientific scrutiny and became more elusive as the investigation progressed. The research team experienced many of the same things the Sherman family had reported. Equipment would malfunction at critical moments, team members would witness events that couldn't be recorded, and the ranch seemed to have an almost playful relationship with their attempts to study it. Some researchers reported feeling like they were being watched constantly, while others described a sense of intelligence behind the phenomena. as if something was deliberately staying just beyond the reach of scientific verification. Dr. Colm Kelleher, a biochemist who served as NIDS deputy administrator, spent years on the ranch and documented his experiences in the book Hunt for the Skinwalker. He described the location as a living laboratory, where the normal rules of physics seemed to be suspended. Kelleher and his team witnessed cattle mutilations in real time, observed unidentified aerial phenomena, and documented electromagnetic anomalies that defied conventional explanation. One of the most intriguing aspects of the NIDS investigation was their discovery that the phenomena seemed to be localized to specific areas of the ranch. They identified what they called hotspots, locations where activity was consistently higher than in other areas. These zones didn't correspond to any obvious geographical features, and attempts to find underground structures or natural explanations for the increased activity were unsuccessful. The team also noted that the phenomena seemed to respond to human presence and attention. Activity would often increase when new researchers arrived on the property, as if whatever was causing the events was curious about the newcomers. Conversely, long-term residents of the ranch reported that the phenomena would sometimes become dormant for weeks or months at a time, only to resume with renewed intensity when least expected. After several years of investigation, NIDS concluded their formal study of the ranch without reaching any definitive conclusions about the nature of the phenomena. The organization had documented numerous anomalous events, collected thousands of hours of data, and spent millions of dollars on the investigation. But they were unable to provide a scientific explanation for what was happening on the property. In 2016, the ranch was sold again, this time to Brandon Fugel, a Utah real estate developer and technology entrepreneur. Fugel has continued the scientific investigation of the property, bringing in new equipment and researchers while maintaining the same commitment to rigorous documentation that characterized the NIDS years. His team has reported ongoing anomalous activity, including electromagnetic disturbances, unexplained aerial phenomena, and equipment malfunctions that mirror the experiences of previous investigators. The ranch has also become the subject of a History Channel series called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, which follows Fugel's team as they attempt to unravel the mysteries of the property. While the show has brought increased public attention to the location, it has also raised questions about the balance between scientific investigation and entertainment value. Throughout all of these investigations, the bulletproof wolf encounter remains one of the most compelling and unexplained incidents in the ranch's history. Terry Sherman's account has never been contradicted or explained away, and similar encounters with seemingly invulnerable animals have been reported by other witnesses over the years. The incident raises fundamental questions about the nature of reality and the limits of our understanding of the physical world. Some researchers have proposed that the ranch might be located at some kind of dimensional intersection, a place where the normal rules of physics don't apply consistently. Others suggest that the phenomena might be related to unknown electromagnetic properties of the area, possibly connected to underground mineral deposits or geological formations. Still, others believe that the ranch might be the site of secret government experiments, though no evidence has been found to support this theory. The government's interest in Skinwalker Ranch became public knowledge in 2017 when it was revealed that the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program had contracted with Bigelow Aerospace to study the property. This disclosure added a new dimension to the mystery, suggesting that the phenomena at the ranch might have national security implications. What makes Skinwalker Ranch particularly intriguing is the consistency of reports across different time periods and investigators. The Sherman family, the NIDS researchers, and Fugel's current team have all documented similar types of phenomena, despite using different methodologies and equipment. This consistency suggests that whatever is happening at the ranch is not simply the result of misidentification, hoaxes, or psychological factors. The ranch continues to generate new mysteries and questions. Recent investigations have focused on the possibility that the phenomena might be connected to consciousness itself, with some researchers suggesting that the ranch responds to the thoughts and intentions of the people studying it. This theory would explain why the phenomena seem to become more elusive as scientific scrutiny increases, and why different investigators sometimes report different types of activity. The bulletproof wolf encounter that started this whole investigation remains as mysterious today as it was when Terry Sherman first pulled that trigger. Despite decades of scientific investigation, millions of dollars in research funding, and the attention of some of the brightest minds in various fields, we're no closer to understanding what happened that winter night in 1995. The wolf that walked away from 4 direct hits continues to challenge our understanding of what's possible in the natural world. Whether you believe in paranormal phenomena or not, Skinwalker Ranch represents something unique in the annals of unexplained events. It's a place where multiple credible witnesses have reported consistent anomalies over extended periods of time, where scientific investigation has documented genuine mysteries, and where the normal explanations for unusual events simply don't seem to apply. The ranch forces us to confront the possibility that there are aspects of reality we don't yet understand, phenomena that exist beyond the current boundaries of scientific knowledge. As investigations continue and new technologies are brought to bear on the mysteries of Skinwalker Ranch, one thing remains certain. This 512-acre patch of Utah desert continues to challenge everything we think we know about the world around us. And somewhere in that high desert landscape, the memory of a wolf that couldn't be killed continues to haunt everyone who's tried to understand what really happened on that cold winter night. The high desert of northeastern Arizona presents a landscape that seems almost alien to those unfamiliar with its rhythms. During the day, temperatures can soar past 100 degrees, baking the red earth until it cracks like broken pottery. But when the sun disappears behind the mesas, the desert transforms into something entirely different. The rocks that absorbed heat all day begin their slow release, creating thermal currents that whisper through the canyons. Stars emerge in numbers that seem impossible to those accustomed to light pollution, and the Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of ancient light. It was in this environment that 2 friends, college students from Phoenix, decided to spend a weekend camping. Marcus, a 22-year-old geology major, and his friend Jake had been planning this trip for months. Both were outdoor enthusiasts, experienced campers who had spent countless nights under the stars throughout Arizona and New Mexico. They were not the type to be easily spooked by strange sounds or shadows in the night. The Navajo reservation, where they had chosen to camp, is not just a geographical location, but a living repository of one of North America's oldest continuous cultures. The Diné, as the Navajo people call themselves, have inhabited this region for centuries, developing a complex understanding of the land and its inhabitants that extends far beyond what modern science recognizes. Their oral traditions speak of beings that exist in the spaces between the physical and spiritual worlds, entities that can take many forms and serve various purposes in the cosmic order. Among these beings are those known in English as skinwalkers, though the Navajo themselves rarely speak of them directly, especially to outsiders. These are not creatures of folklore in the Western sense, but rather part of a belief system that acknowledges the existence of individuals who have gained the ability to transform into animals or other forms through the practice of the darkest aspects of traditional medicine. The very mention of such beings is considered dangerous by many Navajo people, as speaking of them is believed to potentially draw their attention. The concept of shape-shifting entities is not unique to Navajo culture. Throughout the American Southwest, various indigenous groups have maintained traditions that speak of beings capable of assuming different forms. The Hopi speak of the Skinwalker as a witch who has gained the power to transform into animals. The Ute people have stories of beings that can take the appearance of any creature they choose. These traditions share common elements. The idea that certain individuals can transcend the normal boundaries between human and animal, and that such transformations are often associated with malevolent intent. Modern anthropologists and folklorists have studied these traditions extensively, noting the consistency of certain details across different tribal groups and geographical regions. The ability to mimic voices, the preference for operating under cover of darkness, the association with remote locations far from human settlements, these elements appear repeatedly in accounts spanning centuries and covering thousands of square miles of the American Southwest. What makes these traditions particularly unsettling to outside observers is their treatment as literal truth rather than metaphorical stories. Unlike European folklore, which often presents supernatural beings as symbolic representations of natural forces or human psychology, Southwestern indigenous traditions speak of these entities as real, physical beings that can be encountered under specific circumstances. Marcus and Jake had chosen a campsite in a remote canyon approximately 40 miles northeast of Window Rock, the capital of the Navajo Nation. The location was accessible only by a dirt road that wound through increasingly rugged terrain, eventually requiring them to hike the final 2 miles with their gear. They had obtained the necessary permits and had been careful to respect all posted boundaries and cultural sites. Their campsite sat on a small plateau overlooking a deep canyon with towering sandstone walls rising on three sides and a clear view of the desert floor stretching to the horizon. The geological formation of this particular canyon was typical of the Colorado Plateau region. Layers of sedimentary rock, deposited over millions of years, had been carved by wind and water into the dramatic landscape that characterizes much of the Four Corners region. The red sandstone that dominated the canyon walls was Navajo sandstone, formed during the Jurassic period when this area was covered by vast sand dunes. Above that lay the Carmel Formation, a mixture of limestone and sandstone that created the distinctive banded appearance of the upper canyon walls. The canyon itself was relatively young in geological terms, carved by a seasonal stream that flowed only during the brief but intense thunderstorms that characterized the region's weather patterns. During most of the year, the canyon floor was dry, covered with a mixture of sand and gravel that supported sparse vegetation adapted to the arid conditions. Juniper trees clung to cracks in the rock walls, their twisted forms testament to the harsh conditions they endured. The first day passed without incident. They set up their camp in the late afternoon, cooked dinner over a small camp stove, and spent the evening watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of orange and purple. As darkness fell, they built a modest fire and settled in for what they expected to be a peaceful night under the stars. The temperature dropped steadily, and by 10 o'clock they had retreated to their sleeping bags, though they remained outside their tent, preferring to sleep under the open sky. Jake fell asleep first, his breathing becoming deep and regular within minutes of lying down. Marcus remained awake longer, listening to the subtle sounds of the desert night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice echoing off the canyon walls before fading into silence. An owl hooted from a hidden perch among the rocks. These were familiar sounds, comforting in their predictability. The night sky above them was spectacular, unmarred by any light pollution. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon, a river of stars so dense that it seemed almost solid. Satellites traced their paths across the constellations, and occasionally a meteor would streak across the darkness, burning up in the atmosphere with a brief flash of light. The silence was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat, the sound of blood moving through his ears. By 11:30, Marcus had also drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle crackling of the dying fire and the vast silence that seemed to press down from the star-filled sky above. The night was clear and still, with no wind to disturb the perfect quiet that had settled over the canyon. It was just after midnight when the first sound shattered that peace. Marcus woke instantly, his body responding to something his conscious mind had not yet processed. For a moment, he lay perfectly still, listening, trying to identify what had pulled him from sleep. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting barely enough light to illuminate their immediate campsite. Jake remained motionless in his sleeping bag, apparently still deep in sleep. Then it came again. A low, guttural growl that seemed to emerge from the very rocks themselves. The sound was unlike anything Marcus had heard before, neither fully animal nor human, but something that existed in the uncomfortable space between the two. It echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the walls and returning as a distorted whisper that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The growl had a quality that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to some primitive part of the brain, the ancient circuitry that had kept human ancestors alive in a world full of predators. It was the sound of something large, something powerful, and something that did not belong in the normal order of things. Marcus's first instinct was to wake Jake, but before he could move, another sound followed the growl. This time, it was a voice, Jake's voice, but wrong, distorted. As if someone were speaking through a broken radio, the words stretched and warped, but still unmistakably recognizable. "Come here." Marcus's blood turned to ice. Jake was lying 3 feet away, still breathing deeply in sleep. Yet the voice that had just called out was undeniably his friend's, carrying the same inflection and tone that he had heard thousands of times over their years of friendship. But there was something else in it, something that made every instinct scream danger. The voice had come from somewhere above them, from the direction of the canyon rim. In the darkness, it was impossible to see anything beyond the small circle of light cast by the dying embers of their fire. The canyon walls rose like black curtains on three sides, and the open side faced out over the desert floor, equally dark and featureless. "Come here," the voice called again, this time from a different direction. The sound seemed to originate from somewhere up on the canyon rim, perhaps 50 yards from their campsite. Marcus reached over and shook Jake's shoulder, whispering urgently for him to wake up. Jake stirred slowly, the deep sleep of exhaustion making him sluggish to respond. When he finally opened his eyes, Marcus quickly explained what he had heard. Jake listened with growing concern, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as the implications became clear. "That wasn't me," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've been asleep." As if in response to his words, the voice called out again, this time closer. "Come here, I need help." The mimicry was perfect. Every nuance of Jake's speech patterns, every subtle characteristic that made his voice unique, was reproduced with unsettling accuracy. But underneath the familiar tones was something else, something that suggested the speaker was not entirely comfortable with the human vocal apparatus it was using. There was a slight mechanical quality to the voice, as if it were being produced by something that understood the sounds but not the natural rhythm of human speech. The pauses between words were slightly too long, the emphasis on certain syllables slightly off. It was like listening to a very sophisticated recording that had been subtly corrupted. Marcus grabbed his flashlight, a powerful LED model that could illuminate objects at considerable distance. His hands shook slightly as he switched it on and began scanning the canyon rim above their campsite. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar landscape of red rock and sparse vegetation. For several seconds, he saw nothing unusual. The flashlight beam swept across the canyon walls, illuminating the layered rock formations and the occasional juniper tree that had found purchase in a crack or crevice. The light created stark contrasts between the illuminated areas and the deep shadows beyond, making it difficult to distinguish between rock formations and potential threats. Then the light found it. Standing on a ridge approximately 60 yards away was a figure. At first glance, it appeared to be a man, tall and lean, wearing what looked like tattered clothing. But as Marcus adjusted the focus of his flashlight, the details became more disturbing. The figure's limbs were wrong, elongated beyond normal human proportions. Its arms hung nearly to its knees, and its legs seemed to bend at angles that suggested additional joints. The clothing, which had initially appeared to be torn fabric, revealed itself to be something else entirely, hanging in strips that moved independently of any wind. Most disturbing of all was the skin. Where the flashlight beam struck the figure, it revealed a mottled gray surface that seemed to shift and change texture even as they watched. The skin appeared to be neither fully human nor animal, but something that existed in a state of constant transformation. In some areas, it looked smooth and pale like human skin that had never seen sunlight. In others, it appeared rough and textured, like tree bark or stone. But it was the face that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. Despite the alien proportions of the body, despite the wrong color and texture of the skin, the face was unmistakably Jake's. Every feature was perfectly reproduced, from the shape of his nose to the curve of his jawline. Even the expression was familiar, the slight smile that Jake often wore when he was amused by something. The resemblance was so perfect that for a moment, Marcus wondered if he was looking at Jake himself, if his friend had somehow gotten up and walked to the canyon rim without him noticing. But Jake was still lying beside him, and when Marcus glanced over, he could see his friend's face in the reflected light from the flashlight beam. The only difference was the eyes. Where Jake's eyes were brown and warm, this thing's eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light that seemed to emanate from within. The glow was not reflected light from the flashlight beam, but something generated by the creature itself, pulsing gently like the breathing of some internal fire. "Come here," the creature called again, and this time they could see its mouth moving. The voice was still Jake's, but watching it emerge from that familiar yet wrong face created a sense of vertigo that made Marcus feel physically ill. Jake grabbed his own flashlight and added its beam to his friend's. The additional light revealed more details that only increased their horror. The creature's hands were too long, with fingers that seemed to have too many joints. Each finger ended in what looked like a normal human fingernail, but the proportions were all wrong, as if someone had taken a human hand and stretched it like taffy. Its feet, barely visible at the edge of the light, appeared to end in something that was neither shoe nor hoof nor paw, but a disturbing amalgamation of all three. The feet were elongated like a human's, but seemed to have additional toes or claws that extended beyond what should have been possible. "What do you want?" Jake called out, his voice cracking slightly with fear and confusion at seeing his own face staring back at him from that impossible form. The creature tilted its head, the movement too fluid, too serpentine for human anatomy. The neck seemed to bend at angles that would have broken a normal spine, and the head rotated further than any human head should have been able to turn. When it spoke again, it was not in Jake's voice, but in Marcus's. The mimicry was just as perfect, just as unsettling. "I want to come down there," it said, using Marcus's own speech patterns and inflections. "I want to sit by your fire." The two friends looked at each other in growing panic. The creature had somehow absorbed not just their voices, but their mannerisms, their ways of speaking. It was as if it had been listening to them for hours, learning, practicing, preparing for this moment. The realization that they had been observed without their knowledge added a new dimension of terror to their situation. How long had this thing been watching them? Had it been there when they arrived, hidden among the rocks, studying their movements and voices? Or had it approached during the night, drawn by their fire or their conversation? "We need to leave," Marcus whispered, "right now." But even as he spoke, the creature began to move. It did not walk down the canyon wall as a human would, carefully picking its way among the rocks. Instead, it seemed to flow, its elongated limbs finding purchase on surfaces that should not have been able to support any weight. It moved with the fluid grace of water running downhill, never pausing, never hesitating, always maintaining that terrible eye contact. The movement was hypnotic in its wrongness. The creature's limbs bent and flexed in ways that defied human anatomy, allowing it to navigate the steep canyon wall with an ease that no normal person could have achieved. It moved like a spider, like a snake, like something that had never been constrained by the limitations of a human skeleton. The friends began frantically packing their gear, stuffing sleeping bags and equipment into their backpacks with no regard for organization. The creature continued its descent, and as it drew closer, they could hear other sounds, soft laughter that perfectly reproduced their own voices from earlier in the evening, fragments of conversations they had shared around the campfire, played back with mechanical precision, but wrong timing, wrong context. "Remember when we saw that sunset?" the creature said in Jake's voice, though they had never spoken those exact words. "Remember how beautiful it was?" Then, switching to Marcus's voice, "Yeah, it was amazing. We should come back here again." The conversation was a patchwork of their actual words, reassembled into something that sounded almost normal, but felt fundamentally wrong. It was as if the creature had recorded their entire evening and was now playing it back in random order, testing different combinations to see which ones produced the desired effect. The creature's vocal mimicry was becoming more sophisticated as they listened. It began incorporating not just their words, but their laughter, their sighs, even the small unconscious sounds they made while thinking. It was building a complete audio profile of their personalities, learning to become them in ways that went beyond simple imitation. By the time they had their essential gear packed, the creature had reached the canyon floor and was approaching their campsite. In the combined beams of their flashlights, they could see it more clearly than ever. The gray skin was not uniform but seemed to shift between different textures, sometimes appearing smooth like human skin, other times rough like tree bark or stone. The tattered clothing revealed itself to be not fabric at all, but strips of something organic that hung from the creature's frame like molting skin. Up close, the wrongness of its proportions became even more apparent. The torso was too long, the limbs too thin, the joints too flexible. It was as if someone had taken a human form and stretched it, distorted it, made it into something that retained the basic shape but lost all the essential qualities that made it recognizably human. "Don't leave," it said, now alternating between their voices with each word. "The night is so beautiful. Stay and watch the stars with me." The creature's face, still wearing Jake's features, smiled as it spoke. But the smile was wrong, too wide, stretching beyond the normal limits of human facial muscles. The expression was a perfect reproduction of Jake's smile, but exaggerated to an unsettling degree, as if the creature understood the mechanics of the expression, but not its natural boundaries. The friends shouldered their packs and began moving toward the trail that would lead them back to their vehicle. The creature followed, maintaining a distance of about 20 yards but matching their pace exactly. It moved with an unsettling gait, sometimes walking upright like a human, other times dropping to all fours and covering ground with the fluid motion of a large predator. When it moved on all fours, the illusion of humanity disappeared entirely. The elongated limbs that had seemed merely wrong when it stood upright now revealed their true purpose. This was a creature designed for quadrupedal movement, and the human form it wore was nothing more than a disguise, a costume that it could assume when necessary, but that was not its natural state. As they climbed out of the canyon, the creature continued its vocal mimicry, but the performance was becoming more elaborate. It began reproducing entire conversations from their past, discussions they had shared months or even years earlier. Somehow, it had access to memories that should have been private, personal moments that no outside observer could have witnessed. "Do you remember when we first met?" it said in Marcus's voice. "In that philosophy class freshman year?" "Yeah," it replied to itself in Jake's voice. "You were arguing with the professor about free will." The conversation was accurate in every detail, a perfect reproduction of an exchange that had taken place 3 years earlier in a classroom hundreds of miles away. The realization that the creature somehow had access to their shared history added a new dimension of terror to their flight. How could it know these things? The conversation it was reproducing had taken place in a crowded lecture hall at Arizona State University, witnessed by dozens of other students. There was no way this creature could have been present. No way it could have overheard their words. Yet it was reciting their dialogue with perfect accuracy, down to the specific philosophical arguments they had made and the professor's responses. The creature began cycling through other memories, other conversations. It reproduced a discussion they had shared during a camping trip the previous summer, an argument they had gotten into about a girl they both liked, even a phone conversation from the week before about their plans for this very trip. Each reproduction was flawless, capturing not just their words but their emotions, their tone, the subtle interplay of friendship and rivalry that characterized their relationship. The trail back to their car was treacherous in the darkness, requiring careful navigation among loose rocks and sudden drop-offs. Under normal circumstances, they would have moved slowly, testing each step with their flashlights. But with the creature following behind them, they pushed forward as quickly as they dared, accepting the risk of a fall as preferable to whatever the thing behind them intended. The path wound upward through a series of switchbacks carved into the canyon wall. In daylight, the trail offered spectacular views of the surrounding desert, but in darkness, it became a narrow ribbon of uncertain footing, bordered by invisible drops. Loose scree shifted under their boots, sending small avalanches of pebbles cascading into the darkness below. The creature seemed to have no difficulty with the terrain. It flowed over obstacles that forced the friends to climb or detour, always maintaining that precise distance, never falling behind, but never quite catching up. Its yellow eyes remained fixed on them, unblinking, reflecting their flashlight beams like the eyes of a nocturnal animal caught in headlights. The glow from its eyes was unlike anything in nature. It was not the simple reflection of light that characterized the eyes of cats or other night-adapted animals, but something that seemed to generate its own illumination. The light pulsed gently, growing brighter when the creature spoke and dimming when it was silent, as if it were connected to some internal energy source. As they climbed higher, approaching the rim of the canyon where they had left their vehicle, the creature's vocalizations became more frantic. It began cycling through their voices more rapidly, sometimes speaking in harmony with itself, creating an impossible duet of their own words spoken back to them. "Please don't go," it pleaded in both voices simultaneously. "We were having such a good time. The fire is still warm. We could tell stories." The harmonized speech created an effect that was deeply unsettling, as if the creature was struggling to maintain its human facade and the effort was causing it to fragment. Sometimes the voices would drift slightly out of sync, creating an echo effect that made it sound as if multiple entities were speaking. The creature began incorporating sounds that it should not have been able to produce. It reproduced the crackling of their campfire, the sound of wind through the canyon, even the distant call of the coyote they had heard earlier in the evening. It was as if it had absorbed not just their voices, but the entire acoustic environment of their campsite. "Listen," it said in Marcus's voice, and then produced a perfect reproduction of the owl they had heard hooting in the rocks. "Even the night wants you to stay." The sound was so accurate that for a moment, Marcus found himself looking around for the owl, his mind struggling to accept that the sound was coming from the creature behind them. The mimicry extended beyond human speech to encompass the entire natural world, suggesting abilities that went far beyond simple vocal imitation. When they finally reached their car, the friends threw their gear into the back without bothering to secure it properly. Marcus fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them twice before managing to unlock the doors. Jake kept his flashlight trained on the creature, which had stopped at the edge of the parking area, and was watching them with those terrible glowing eyes. The parking area was nothing more than a widened section of the dirt road, marked by a few wooden posts and a weathered sign warning visitors to respect the cultural significance of the area. Their car, a battered Honda Civic that had seen better days, looked almost absurdly normal in the beam of Jake's flashlight, a piece of the ordinary world that seemed out of place in this nightmare landscape. The engine turned over on the first try, and Marcus immediately put the car in reverse, backing away from the creature as quickly as he dared on the rough dirt road. In the headlights, they could see it clearly for the first time without the narrow focus of their flashlights. The full view was somehow even more disturbing than the partial glimpses they had caught earlier. The creature stood perfectly still, its elongated arms hanging at its sides, its head tilted at that impossible angle. The face was still Jake's, but now they could see that the resemblance was not quite perfect. It was as if someone had tried to recreate Jake's features from memory, getting most of the details right, but missing some subtle element that made the whole thing feel wrong. The proportions were slightly off, the features just a little too sharp, the skin tone not quite matching Jake's natural coloring. It was like looking at a photograph that had been subtly altered, recognizable but fundamentally wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. As they drove away, bouncing and lurching over the rutted road, Marcus kept checking the rearview mirror. For the first few minutes, the creature remained where they had left it, a motionless figure silhouetted against the star-filled sky. But as they rounded a bend and began the long descent toward the main road, he saw something that made his blood freeze. The creature was following them, not running, not pursuing them with any visible urgency, but walking steadily down the middle of the road behind them. Its pace was unhurried, almost casual, but somehow it was keeping up with their vehicle despite the fact that they were traveling at nearly 30 miles per hour over the rough terrain. "It's following us," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. Jake turned in his seat to look back, and they both watched in horrified fascination as the creature maintained its steady pace behind them. In the red glow of the taillights, its yellow eyes were clearly visible, fixed on their vehicle with unwavering attention. The creature's gait was unlike anything they had ever seen. It moved with a flowing, almost liquid motion that seemed to cover ground without effort. Its elongated limbs carried it forward with a rhythm that was hypnotic and wrong, each step covering more distance than should have been possible. They drove faster, pushing the car to its limits on the dangerous road. Rocks pinged off the undercarriage, and the suspension groaned under the stress of the rough terrain. The steering wheel vibrated in Marcus's hands as they hit pothole after pothole, but he maintained their speed, desperate to put distance between themselves and their pursuer. But no matter how fast they went, when Marcus checked the mirror, the creature was still there, walking with that same unhurried gait, never falling behind. It was as if the laws of physics didn't apply to it, as if it existed in a reality where distance and speed were merely suggestions rather than absolute constraints. The dirt road seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the desert landscape like a brown ribbon laid across the dark earth. In daylight, the drive from their campsite to the highway took about 45 minutes. In darkness, with adrenaline coursing through their systems and a supernatural entity following behind them, It felt like hours. The creature continued its vocal performance even as it pursued them. Through the open windows of the car, they could hear it calling out in their voices, the sound somehow carrying over the noise of the engine and the rattling of loose gravel under the tires. "Why are you running?" it called in Jake's voice. "I just wanted to talk." "Come back," it added in Marcus's voice. "The night is still young." The fact that it could maintain its vocal mimicry while moving at such speed suggested that its abilities went far beyond anything they had initially understood. This was not simply a creature that could change its appearance, but something that operated according to entirely different rules than the natural world they knew. It was only when they reached the paved highway and could accelerate to highway speeds that the creature finally disappeared from view. Even then, they drove for another hour before either of them felt safe enough to speak about what they had experienced. The transition from the dirt road to the highway felt like crossing a threshold between two different worlds. The smooth asphalt, the painted lines, the occasional passing truck, all seemed like artifacts from a more rational universe where creatures did not mimic human voices or pursue cars on foot at impossible speeds. The remainder of their drive back to Phoenix passed in relative silence, both friends lost in their own thoughts as they tried to process what they had witnessed. The familiar landscape of the interstate, with its truck stops and billboards and other travelers, seemed almost surreal after their encounter in the canyon. The normal world felt fragile, as if it were nothing more than a thin veneer covering something far stranger and more dangerous. They stopped once for gas at a 24-hour station outside Flagstaff. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by the mundane reality of convenience store snacks and lottery tickets, their experience in the canyon began to feel like a shared hallucination. But when they looked at each other, they could see the truth reflected in each other's eyes. What they had witnessed was real, regardless of how impossible it seemed. The gas station attendant, a tired-looking man in his 50s, asked if they were okay. They must have looked as shaken as they felt, pale and jumpy, constantly glancing over their shoulders. Marcus mumbled something about car trouble, paid for the gas, and they got back on the road as quickly as possible. As they drove through the pre-dawn darkness, Jake finally broke the silence that had stretched between them for miles. "What do you think it was?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Marcus had been asking himself the same question for hours, running through every possible explanation he could think of. A person in a costume seemed impossible given the creature's proportions and movements. Mass hallucination was equally unlikely, given that they had both seen and heard the same things. Some kind of unknown animal was ruled out by the perfect vocal mimicry and the human-like intelligence it had displayed. "I don't know," Marcus replied, "but I know what the Navajo would call it." They had both heard the stories, of course. Growing up in Arizona, it was impossible to avoid the folklore that surrounded the reservation lands. Stories of skinwalkers, of beings that could take any form they chose, of entities that existed in the spaces between the human and animal worlds. But hearing stories and experiencing the reality were two entirely different things. The stories spoke of creatures that were once human, individuals who had gained the power of transformation through the practice of forbidden rituals. They were said to be motivated by malice, by a desire to spread fear and confusion among those who encountered them. The creature they had encountered certainly fit that description. Its perfect mimicry of their voices, its access to their private memories, its relentless pursuit, all suggested an intelligence that was both human-like and fundamentally alien. It had seemed to take pleasure in their fear, to feed on their confusion and terror. As the sun began to rise over the desert, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, the events of the night began to feel more distant, more dreamlike. But the memory of those glowing yellow eyes, of hearing their own voices spoken by something that was not human, remained vivid and disturbing. They reached Phoenix as the city was beginning to wake up, the early morning traffic building on the freeways as people headed to work. The familiar sights of urban life, the strip malls and office buildings in suburban neighborhoods, provided a comforting return to normalcy. But both friends knew that their understanding of the world had been fundamentally changed by their experience in the canyon. Marcus dropped Jake off at his apartment and drove home to his own place, a small studio near the university campus. He sat in his car for several minutes after parking, reluctant to get out, still feeling as if he were being watched. The rational part of his mind told him that they were safe now, that whatever they had encountered was confined to that remote canyon. But a deeper, more primitive part of his brain remained on high alert, scanning the shadows for signs of pursuit. Over the following days, both friends struggled to return to their normal routines. Marcus found it difficult to concentrate on his studies, his mind constantly returning to the events in the canyon. Jake reported similar problems, describing a persistent feeling of being observed that made it hard for him to relax even in familiar surroundings. They met several times to discuss their experience, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Each conversation revealed new details that they had forgotten in the immediate aftermath of their encounter. The creature's impossible movements, its access to their private memories, the way it had seemed to feed on their fear, all suggested abilities that went far beyond anything in the natural world. Marcus began researching similar encounters, scouring the internet for accounts that matched their experience. He found dozens of stories from across the Southwest, reports of beings that could mimic human voices and appearances, creatures that pursued travelers through remote areas, entities that seemed to exist at the intersection of the physical and spiritual worlds. The consistency of these accounts was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it suggested that they were not alone in their experience, that others had encountered similar beings and lived to tell about it. Disturbing because it implied that such creatures were more common than most people realized, that they existed in the spaces between the known and unknown, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal themselves. Some of the accounts he found dated back decades, stories passed down through families or recorded by anthropologists studying Native American folklore. Others were more recent, posted on internet forums by people who seemed as confused and frightened as Marcus and Jake had been. The details varied, but the core elements remained consistent. Creatures that could assume human form, perfect vocal mimicry, encounters in remote locations, and a sense of malevolent intelligence behind the phenomena. One account particularly caught Marcus's attention. It was written by a park ranger who had worked in the Four Corners region for over 20 years. The ranger described multiple encounters with what he called mimics, creatures that seemed to specialize in reproducing human voices and appearances. According to his account, these beings were most active during the new moon, when the darkness was deepest, and they seemed to be drawn to isolated campers and hikers. The ranger's description of the creatures matched Marcus and Jake's experience in almost every detail. The elongated limbs, the mottled gray skin, the glowing yellow eyes, the perfect vocal mimicry, all were consistent with what they had witnessed. The ranger also noted that the creatures seemed to have access to information they should not have been able to obtain, reproducing conversations and memories from their victims' pasts with unsettling accuracy. Most disturbing of all was the ranger's conclusion that these encounters were becoming more frequent. He speculated that increased human activity in remote areas was bringing people into contact with beings that had previously remained hidden. The expansion of recreational camping and hiking into previously untouched wilderness areas was creating opportunities for encounters that had been rare in the past. Marcus shared this information with Jake, and they both found it deeply unsettling. The idea that their experience was part of a larger pattern, that other people were encountering similar beings with increasing frequency, suggested that the boundary between the known and unknown worlds was becoming more permeable. They also discovered that their encounter had taken place during a new moon, exactly as the park ranger had described. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore, suggesting that the creature's appearance was not random but followed some kind of pattern or cycle. As weeks passed, the immediate terror of their encounter began to fade, replaced by a deeper unease about the nature of reality itself. Both friends found themselves questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine before. If creatures like the one they had encountered could exist undetected in the modern world, what else might be hiding in the spaces between the known and unknown? The experience had also changed their relationship with the natural world. Places that had once seemed peaceful and welcoming now carried an undercurrent of potential danger. The vast wilderness areas of the Southwest, which they had always seen as refuges from the complexity of modern life, now seemed to harbor secrets that were better left undisturbed. Marcus found himself avoiding camping trips, making excuses when friends invited him to join them in the backcountry. Jake reported similar feelings, describing a persistent anxiety whenever he found himself in remote locations after dark. The freedom and peace they had once found in the wilderness had been replaced by a constant awareness of being watched, of existing at the mercy of forces beyond their understanding. Their friends and family noticed the change in their behavior, but neither Marcus nor Jake felt comfortable sharing the details of their experience. The story sounded too fantastic, too much like something from a horror movie to be taken seriously by people who had not witnessed it themselves. When pressed for explanations, they would mumble vague references to a bad camping trip and change the subject. The isolation of their experience was perhaps the most difficult aspect to bear. They had witnessed something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of the modern world, but they had no way to share that knowledge without risking ridicule or disbelief. The creature they had encountered existed in a space between worlds, and their knowledge of it seemed to trap them in a similar liminal state. Marcus began to understand why indigenous cultures treated such encounters with such seriousness, why the mere mention of certain beings was considered dangerous. It was not superstition that drove this caution, but a deep understanding of forces that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. The Navajo prohibition against speaking of skinwalkers was not born from ignorance, but from a wisdom that recognized the danger of drawing the attention of beings that operated according to different rules than the natural world. The creature's perfect reproduction of their voices and memories suggested abilities that went far beyond simple mimicry. It had somehow gained access to information that should have been private, personal details that no outside observer could have known. This implied a form of consciousness that could penetrate human thoughts and memories, that could extract and reproduce the most intimate aspects of human experience. The implications of this ability were deeply disturbing. If the creature could access their memories, what else might it be capable of? Could it influence their thoughts, their emotions, their perceptions of reality? The perfect reproduction of their past conversations suggested a level of mental intrusion that made them feel violated in ways that went beyond physical threat. As the months passed, both friends began to notice subtle changes in their daily lives. Marcus found himself having dreams that felt more like memories, scenes from his past that were somehow different from how he remembered them. In these dreams, there was always a third presence, a watcher who observed but never participated. He would wake with the unsettling feeling that his memories were no longer entirely his own. Jake reported similar experiences, describing a persistent sense that his thoughts were being monitored, that somewhere in the darkness, something was listening to his internal monologue. He began to avoid thinking about their encounter, fearing that dwelling on the memory might somehow summon the creature's attention. The psychological impact of their experience extended beyond simple fear. They had encountered something that existed outside the accepted boundaries of reality, and that knowledge had fundamentally altered their understanding of the world. The comfortable certainties of modern life, the assumption that the natural world operated according to known and predictable laws, had been shattered by their encounter with something that followed entirely different rules. Marcus threw himself into his studies, focusing on the geological sciences as a way to ground himself in the measurable, quantifiable aspects of the natural world. But even his academic work was affected by his experience. When studying the formation of the canyon where they had camped, he found himself wondering what other secrets might be hidden in the layers of sedimentary rock. What other encounters might have taken place in that remote location over the centuries? The canyon itself had become a focal point for his anxiety. He found himself researching its history, looking for other accounts of unusual encounters in the area. What he discovered was a pattern of stories stretching back generations, reports from travelers and settlers who had experienced strange phenomena in that particular location. A survey team from the 1890s had reported hearing voices calling to them from the canyon walls, voices that perfectly mimicked members of their party who were miles away. A group of archaeologists in the 1930s had abandoned their excavation after several team members reported being followed by something that could reproduce their voices and mannerisms with unsettling accuracy. Even more recent accounts existed. A family camping in the area in the 1980s had fled after their youngest child began conversing with something that claimed to be his older brother, despite the fact that the brother was sitting right beside him. The conversation had been recorded on a cassette tape, and the family had played it for local authorities, but no explanation had ever been found for the duplicate voice. The consistency of these accounts across different time periods suggested that the canyon was not just the site of a single encounter, but a location where the boundary between worlds was somehow thinner, where beings from other realms could more easily manifest in the physical world. The creature that Marcus and Jake had encountered was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger pattern that had been repeating itself for generations. This realization brought both comfort and terror. Comfort because it confirmed that their experience was real, that they were not suffering from some shared delusion or psychological break. Terror because it suggested that such encounters were not random events, but part of an ongoing interaction between human beings and entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of reality. The more Marcus researched, the more he began to understand the true scope of what they had encountered. The creature was not simply an animal with unusual abilities, but something that existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual worlds. It was a being that could manipulate reality itself, bending the laws of physics and psychology to serve its own mysterious purposes. The perfect vocal mimicry was just one aspect of its abilities. The creature had also demonstrated the power to access human memories, to move at impossible speeds, to navigate terrain that should have been impassable. These were not the abilities of any known animal, but the powers of something that operated according to entirely different principles than the natural world. As winter approached, Marcus found himself drawn back to the idea of returning to the canyon, not to camp, but to try to understand what they had encountered. The rational part of his mind recognized this as a dangerous impulse, but a deeper part of him felt that their encounter was unfinished, that the creature had been trying to communicate something that they had been too frightened to understand. Jake was horrified when Marcus suggested the possibility of returning to the site of their encounter. The idea of voluntarily placing themselves in danger again seemed like madness to him. But Marcus argued that they had a responsibility to try to understand what they had witnessed, that their knowledge of the creature's existence came with an obligation to learn more about its nature and intentions. The debate between them continued for weeks, with Jake arguing for the wisdom of leaving well enough alone, and Marcus insisting that they had a duty to investigate further. The disagreement began to strain their friendship, with each friend convinced that the other was making a dangerous mistake. The tension between them was resolved in an unexpected way. In early December, Marcus received a phone call from a researcher at Northern Arizona University who had heard about their encounter through mutual acquaintances. Dr. Sarah Chen was an anthropologist who specialized in southwestern indigenous folklore, and she was particularly interested in contemporary accounts of supernatural encounters. Dr. Chen explained that she was conducting a study of modern Skinwalker encounters, collecting first-hand accounts from people who claimed to have witnessed such beings. She had already interviewed dozens of witnesses across the Four Corners region, and she was struck by the consistency of their reports. The details varied, but the core elements remained remarkably similar across different encounters. Marcus and Jake agreed to meet with Dr. Chen, and they spent several hours recounting their experience in detail. She listened without skepticism or judgment, taking careful notes and asking thoughtful questions about aspects of their encounter that they had not previously considered important. Dr. Chen's research had revealed patterns that neither Marcus nor Jake had been aware of. The creatures seemed to be most active during certain lunar phases, particularly during the new moon when darkness was deepest. They appeared to be drawn to specific geographical locations, often places that held cultural significance for indigenous peoples, and they seemed to target individuals who were isolated from their normal social support networks, people who were camping or hiking alone or in small groups. Most significantly, Dr. Chen had discovered that encounters with these beings were becoming more frequent. Her data showed a steady increase in reported sightings over the past 2 decades, with a particularly sharp spike in the last 5 years. She theorized that this increase was related to the expansion of recreational activities into previously remote areas, bringing more people into contact with beings that had traditionally remained hidden. The conversation with Dr. Chen provided Marcus and Jake with a framework for understanding their experience that went beyond simple fear or confusion. They began to see their encounter as part of a larger phenomenon, an ongoing interaction between human beings and entities that existed at the margins of known reality. Dr. Chen also provided them with practical advice for dealing with the psychological aftermath of their encounter. She explained that many witnesses experienced persistent anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a sense of being watched. These symptoms were normal responses to encounters with beings that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. She recommended that they avoid returning to the site of their encounter, at least for the immediate future. The creatures seemed to have territorial behaviors, and returning to a location where an encounter had occurred could potentially trigger another confrontation. She also advised them to be cautious about sharing details of their experience with people who were not prepared to accept the reality of such phenomena. The meeting with Dr. Chen marked a turning point in Marcus and Jake's recovery from their encounter. Having their experience validated by a serious academic researcher helped them to process what they had witnessed without feeling isolated or crazy. They began to understand that they were part of a larger community of people who had encountered similar beings, and that their experience, while traumatic, was not unique. Over the following months, they gradually began to return to their normal routines. The persistent anxiety that had plagued them since their encounter began to fade, replaced by a more manageable awareness of the mysteries that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. They never returned to camping in remote locations, but they were able to find peace in more populated outdoor areas where the risk of supernatural encounters was minimal. Their friendship, which had been strained by their disagreement about returning to the canyon, was ultimately strengthened by their shared experience. They had witnessed something together that few people would ever see, and that knowledge created a bond between them that transcended their differences of opinion about how to respond to it. Years later, both Marcus and Jake would look back on their encounter in the canyon as a defining moment in their lives. It had shattered their assumptions about the nature of reality, but it had also opened their minds to possibilities that they had never previously considered. They had learned that the world was far stranger and more mysterious than they had ever imagined, and that knowledge, while sometimes frightening, was also profoundly humbling. The creature they had encountered remained a mystery. Despite Dr. Chen's research and the accounts of other witnesses, no one had been able to definitively explain what these beings were or where they came from. They existed in the spaces between the known and unknown, challenging human understanding while remaining just beyond the reach of scientific investigation. But perhaps that was as it should be. Some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. Some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. The desert Southwest would continue to hold its secrets, and somewhere in a remote canyon in Arizona, something would continue to watch and wait, calling out in voices that were familiar yet wrong, reminding anyone who encountered it that the world was far more complex and dangerous than most people dared to imagine. The stars still shine over that canyon, cold and distant in the desert sky. The wind still whispers through the rocks, carrying sounds that might be natural or might be something else entirely. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the night is still, travelers report hearing voices calling to them from the darkness, voices that sound like their own but speak words they never said. The canyon remembers. The desert remembers. And somewhere in the space between memory and reality, between the known and unknown, the watchers continue their eternal vigil, waiting for the next encounter, the next opportunity to remind humanity that we are not alone in this vast and mysterious world.